Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm Fennell, and I know some of you from various classes. One of the things that I work on is property, and within property I do a lot with housing, and so this particular CBI is focusing on a paper I'm working on that's about property in housing, which combines two great things, property and housing in one package. Okay, so I will kind of go through and present for a while, but feel free to break in with questions, and I hope people will have questions afterwards. There's a lot of pressure at giving a talk that's called Chicago's Best Ideas, but I think that the idea is that you all are supposed to help generate the best ideas, so I'm counting on you. All right, so one of the things I try to do in this paper that I'm working on is try to think about the things that housing provides to people. Okay, and some of these are fairly obvious, but some of them are maybe a little bit less so. And it's important to recognize that a lot of the things that housing provides may also be provided in other ways. There might be other ways to provide some of these things, and some of the things that housing provides, some of the roles that it plays, have implications for people other than the occupants, of course. Okay, so we think about it providing a consumption stream for occupants, or shelter and privacy, a place to store your stuff. But it's also kind of a portal where you get a lot of other local goods and services. The public education may be tied into where you live, the kinds of police protection, fire protection, all these other things are kind of determined by where you live. And lots of other location-specific benefits and detriments. Very broadly, the idea that realtors always say, location, 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 right? The home is going to matter a lot as to all kinds of things that affect your quality of life. There may also be an investment return involved for the owners. The owners may or may not be the occupants, of course. Housing is also a place for producing lots of stuff. And of course, depending on the situation, it might be a lot of stuff or a little stuff. But things like meals and childcare and laundry services and all kinds of things might be produced in-house. People might also have home businesses. They might do all kinds of things within the home. The home is also an input into other larger things in the environment. It's an input to the local environment in terms of you've got a structure there. It's going to have some kind of impact. It may affect future land uses simply by being there. If you're not going to be there anymore, it might be that the city or the state would have to exercise eminent domain to move you, and that may be politically costly. So the fact that you have a home where it is going to have an impact on future land use possibilities. And also, it's going to be an input to all kinds of social and public goods. Okay, the fact that we have housing in some places and not others, and certain kinds of housing here and not there, all these things affect kind of the experience of living in an area. Okay, so that was a lot of text. For those who are more visual learners, one of the things that I think is interesting is to sort of first identify this idea that kind of comes from property law of what is it that somebody who is, say, the owner of this house actually owns. So we often think about it like this, as kind of being like a column of space that you own. There's sort of an old doctrine that talks about owning down to the depths and up to the heavens, and you maybe own your dwelling, you own the land it sits on, you own this column of space. That's kind of what you own legally, that's your property interest, but it doesn't at all begin to kind of capture what it is to live in the home, and to kind of capture what's really going on, we have to think about the fact that things that are going on inside the home create spillovers and are also kind of vulnerable to spillovers from everything that's happening in the surrounding area, both positive and negative. So a better way of kind of thinking about the home is not really something like this, where we can reduce it to kind of what the metes and bounds that we see in a property description. It's really something kind of rather more like this. Where all kinds of crazy stuff is going on, and law has to manage it somehow. Okay, so we first of all have to decide what we're going to have be part of the package that people own, but then also, whatever that package is, we have to also think about the spillovers that flow from the home, that flow into the home, and how to manage the interface between this person's home and everything else. Okay, so the law gets involved in a bunch of different ways, and this, I think, becomes really interesting because it interacts with the way that individual people choose to live. It has implications for what options are out there. Okay, so different elements of the housing package are controlled by law in a variety of ways. Space is controlled. There may be minimum square footage requirements for a rental. Often there are. There may be a minimum lot size that's required in a suburban area, very commonly. There may be limits on how short or how long you can lease a place in particular areas. There may be all kinds of limits on the quality of your home. There may be implied warranties of habitability that apply that say there has to be a certain standard of quality for the rental home. There may be a lot of limits under zoning law or under covenants about what kind of uses you can engage in when you're at your home. You know, can you do home welding in the front yard? Is that permitted or not permitted? All kinds of questions about what you can and cannot do. There's also a lot of legal input into questions about the risk and returns from a home. Okay, so you know, obviously we've had this past housing meltdown, a lot of attention being given to mortgages. How much risk should households be able to take on? Should they be able to sign a mortgage where there might be a question of not being able to repay it and potentially be displaced? What's kind of the right amount of risk for households to take on? And as part of this, of course, we have the law caring about the people who are living in the dwelling and about their experience. There may be some paternalism involved sometimes, but there also may be a lot of spillovers where what happens is going to have implications for others. Okay, so the law is always, all the time, also managing the interface between individual households and the rest of the community. Partly it does this by enforcing exclusion. If you own property, trespassers can be kicked out. Controlling spillovers, a lot of things about how what we think of as local public goods get produced. That is, the kinds of things that are produced in the community through the cooperation of people in the community, or that are sort of limited to them, things like education or public security, things like that. And then managing the interface between current users and uses, and future uses and uses, which would be this idea that what we have here now is going to have an impact on what will be here later. But we want to try to make sure that what happens here now doesn't have some kind of detrimental impact on our later options. And that can be difficult to measure, be difficult to manage as well. Okay, so a question to sort of ask here, and I mean this partly literally and partly as a metaphor, is how thin should we slice housing? Okay, now there's a question there both for individual households. You know, what do we expect people to do in terms of figuring out what their housing package is like? And then to what extent do we have law involved saying, oh wait, you know, that's sort of too thin. Okay, so we might mean this in a purely literal spatial sense. This is an example of, I think, the thinnest house there is right now that people have documented at least. It's 28 inches wide, pretty narrow. And it actually violates all kinds of building codes, and so it exists only because it's defined as an art installation. Okay, but it fits into this little gap between the two buildings and kind of looks like this inside. And you know, you can't throw a lot of big parties, but you can do certain things here. And then partly it's a question of, well, you know, why not? Why not have houses this thin? Is there some kind of problem with that? And we can think about this broadly to encompass not just questions of spatial configurations, but also other things like how permanent does your connection to your home need to be? You know, to what extent should we have very short-term housing opportunities that the law does more to encourage? Should we have greater ability to take on risk that includes a larger risk of displacement if that means that it lets more people get access to housing initially, and so on? Okay, now there are a lot of different living arrangements that we can imagine. This is a kind of an extreme example of capsule hotels in Japan. I think they exist other places as well. And these were sort of originally designed as being kind of a replacement for a hotel room for businessmen who missed their last train home. They could just stay in the capsule. But during economic downturn times, it's actually turned into kind of a longer-term option for some people. There was a story in the New York Times that profiled the guy pictured here, a 40-year-old who's lived in the capsule for 6 months. Now, of course, he has not lived in the capsule for 6 months. That's sort of his private sleeping space. The point being that you can have a very small space that's sort of your private home that you carve out from the world, that's your sort of private area, but there's a lot of other things that we normally associate with the home, a lot of other functions that you're going to be having to get somewhere outside of the capsule. Okay, so of course these capsule hotels have to offer some other facilities, some lockers and storage and bathing facilities, and some, I think they usually have dining facilities as well and cooking facilities, and all kinds of other things are going to have to be procured sort of outside of the capsule. But the sort of question that we think of as in thinking about this as a legal issue is to what extent there should be limits on sort of how small spaces can be. Now this has come up recently. There's been a lot of interest in smaller and smaller dwellings. And here is a sketch of a planned apartment unit for a building in San Francisco. And there actually are, San Francisco is currently considering lowering the minimum space requirements for rental dwellings to a total of 220 square feet, which that counts sort of everything, including like the shelves and everything. The living space for this particular unit that was designed within that specification is 150 square feet. Which is apparently a little bit less, or like right about the size of a suburban parking space. So that's sort of where the space should be living in. And the Board of Supervisors actually, I think, is supposed to vote today on this. It got delayed a couple times. And the last news story I read said that November 13th was the day they were going to vote to decide whether to reduce the size, the sort of minimum size for rental dwellings. And there's sort of a question of, well, you know, is this a problem, or does this give people an option that might be valuable? You can't really read probably all the text here, but there's all these little features like the table also becomes a bed, and you know, everything sort of pops out of the walls and is multi-purpose. There's some kind of multi-purpose bench here and so on. Now, what makes this design, I think, somewhat more attractive than it might seem in the abstract, here's a picture of the designer inside a model unit. And you can see, maybe you can see, there's kind of really nice finishes, sort of like granite countertops and things, and cherry wood cabinets. And then there's this great view out the window of the Bay Bridge. So it sort of feels like a fancy place to be, even though you're in a very tiny spot. So anyway, it raises lots of questions about whether we think that spatial minimums make sense. Do they remove options that are valuable? Why do we have these? Okay, another issue that comes up in the law and the way that regulation interacts with the home is with regard to what are known as accessory dwelling units, sometimes more colloquially known as granny flats, which is part of your house that you would sort of separate out as a separate dwelling unit for perhaps for a relative. You might rent it out to a third party. And one of the things that this responds to is that, you know, the home is not very flexible. If you want to stay in the same place over an entire lifespan or something, in a lengthy period of time, well, there's probably going to be changes in your family configuration over that period. And ideally, you would actually want a home that would kind of grow and shrink. That would be better. But if we have zoning that forbids, as it often does, accessory dwelling units, or doesn't allow you to subdivide your single-family home to have more people live there because you're in a single-family zone, then some of these things like turning this unit into a bunch of different subunits, sort of indicated by the different colors, those alternatives don't become available. And there's questions about to what extent, you know, the kinds of spillovers that we might worry about in these cases, to what extent that provides kind of a reason for having limits on these when it does turn out to constrain some options that might otherwise be present. Now, you know, I don't want to sort of overstate this. There's some ability to have more flexibility if you can subdivide your home, but it's still pretty costly. It's not like every time you have a guest over, you can kind of like add on an area or knock out a wall or something. So the home already kind of builds in this kind of rigidity that creates yes, some issues, but to some extent it is a function of what the law does about it, sort of how rigid it actually ends up being in fact. Another question is sort of about how much we think housing needs to be tethered to land. On the left here is a sort of an art installation that was sort of exploring the idea of kind of a mobile house that could kind of be put anywhere, rolled around and put in different places. Well, you know, again, art installation. It works as an art installation because it's really cool. Very hard to kind of work out something like this and get permission to be able to just sort of pitch your tent at will around on public spaces. That tends to not be an option that's generally allowed everywhere. The other image on the right is of some signs in Santa Monica forbidding RV parking on residential streets. It's another way to try to get at kind of a mobile idea of housing. In some of the beachfront communities, RVs would sort of park on residential streets and just sort of stay there, and they would live there, you know, over pretty long periods of time. And I guess the residents were annoyed by it or something. They didn't really like people living right at their curb, having another family right out at their curb all the time. And so now we have these limits on the ability to have RV parking. Obviously, lots of issues there about exactly what kinds of regulation there should be, but a question might be whether there should be more done to sort of facilitate ability to have mobile forms of housing as well. Again, it depends on what we think we want housing to do. If we think it's essential that it be this kind of stable place, then that might lead us to a different regime than if we think the opposite. Okay, so what I want to try to do is think about what we would do if we were trying to develop some kind of theory of the home. Okay, and I'm sort of playing here on the idea of the theory of the firm that you might have heard of, which is this question of what is it that we want to put inside the package that we call the home, and what motivates decisions that are made by households about that. What role should the government play in deciding how that configuration should look, and not just in mandating or banning or outlawing things or allowing things, but also in terms of the way that it may encourage or discourage certain ways of setting up your home by policies about transportation, for example, or any number of other policies that the government might engage in. They can make it cheaper or more expensive to kind of draw the lines around your home in a different way. Okay? And so the question is sort of to what extent these legal constraints and interventions interact with markets and what households sort of naturally want to put together in the package to give us the residential experience. And it's helpful, I think, here to think in terms of substitutes and complements a little bit. When we're thinking about what to put inside the home, there's this idea that we kind of want to put things together that are going to fit together in providing the experience of the home so that you're not having to separately go and procure things kind of a la carte all the time. So that you're not having to negotiate every single day to get in your front door. So you're not having to pay go through toll gates or pay trolls to get the chance to sleep in your bed that night. So we know that there are things that sort of having a continual ability to return to the same place provides some benefits, and there are things that are kind of complements to each other in that they become more valuable when they're added together. There are also a lot of substitutes out there in the world for things that you might be able to put in the home. And so we'll talk about that more in a second. We're thinking about kind of what goes in and what goes outside of the sort of owned premises, in a sense. A few considerations that we can kind of draw from some of the literature in law and economics to think about this. Part of it is this question of how much does it cost to deal with outsiders versus sort of dealing with the people who are inside. Okay, so you make your house bigger, maybe that also means you have a bigger household, more people you have to share the interior spaces with. That could be a hassle, right? But if you make your home really small, you constrain the boundaries a lot, then you have to deal with outsiders more to get a lot of things that you might want. There's also this question that comes up, I think, very pointedly in the home about excess capacity, which is a lot of the time people's homes are kind of sitting there, and there's a lot of stuff that's not being used all the time, like for example, my oven is actually never used, but like lots of other people have things in their home that they probably don't use that often, and people who are away at work, the home is sitting there idle. It's extremely hard, currently at least, to do a lot with that excess capacity. It kind of sits there, and you can leave it unused. You could try to find ways to share it, and we'll talk about some of those. But the option can be to try to reduce the excess capacity by making your domain smaller. That may leave you with not enough capacity at other times. Okay, so maybe you never use your guest bedroom that much, but if you have guests over and you don't have it, This is kind of a corollary of the can't easily expand the home idea. Then you have to do something else. You have to contract out. You have to find a hotel for them to stay in. And maybe people don't come over as often if they know you don't have the spare bedroom. And so it ends up having a lot of implications. And so excess capacity becomes a very interesting problem. And then there's sort of questions about what you can outsource, which is sort of the flip side of the excess capacity issue. How hard is it to get things that you choose to not put inside your home? Okay, so the first point I want to sort of make here is that scale really matters a lot here. We think about what the home is meant to produce. What kinds of things are people trying to accomplish with the home? Well, you know, if they're trying to basically provide shelter as cheaply as possible, there may be economies of scale that speak to that say, okay, you know, maybe shelter can be more efficiently provided to a larger family than a smaller family. But if they're trying to produce something else, like intimacy or autonomy, or you know, a feeling of having a lot of space around you, then maybe a smaller household is what's needed. And so we always have this kind of question of what's going on inside, kind of internally governing, with what's going on outside. These are the same questions that Kozak asked about the firm, and that Harold Dimsetz and Bob Ellickson have asked about in thinking about land more generally, and about land holdings, and to what extent it should be privately sort of parcelized into smaller segments versus shared communally. There's all these kinds of questions about trade-offs in dealing with insiders and outsiders. Henry Smith has written about this issue of scale as well. So we can make the circle bigger of the home, right? And we can sort of disappeared there, the problem of dealing with outsiders. But then we have more internal governance to think about. Okay, what do the circles represent? Well, these might be things that you could have inside your home, or you could have outside your home, like you know, maybe exercise facilities or a yard, or something like that. You know, you can have more stuff inside your home. It may require having more people in to help care for it in some cases. It may require, for reasons of economy, a larger household. But it may increase your internal governance burdens. If you go the other way and you're always having to procure things a la carte out in the world, well, that may produce less internal governance, but more of dealing with outsiders. And the point for us that really matters is that when we're thinking about law, there's tons of things that the law can do to make it easier or harder on either side of the equation, especially questions of dealing with outsiders to coordinate. Okay, so an example here is, say you live in this middle house here that's marked with an X. Unfortunately, you're kind of landlocked. That's a problem in itself. But putting that aside, assume there's streets or something. So you're there. Let's suppose that you want to be as far away from all the other houses as you are in this picture. Okay, can you also see the little blue boxes? Those are the other houses. Well, there's a couple ways you could accomplish that. Way one, if you want to be sure you're that far away from everyone, is you could just buy that entire parcel of land, right? You could just own it. And that would enable you to be sure that nobody, at least without your permission, could be closer than your fence line. The other alternative, though, of course, is that we could have you be part of a community where you just own sort of the yellow parcel shown there, and everyone agrees that they're going to leave space around their house, right? And so you're able to, by entering into agreements with other people through covenants or through zoning implicitly, create a world where you get the whole space buffer without having to individually buy that much space. Okay, so this is a way that law makes it cheaper to coordinate with other people. This is only one example. There's lots of other things that could be coordinated over, and this particular example, may not always be the best way to go. We may think, well, actually, that's sort of awful. It makes it easier to have sprawl because everybody is able to kind of cluster together in this way and have there be lots of open space. Lots of sort of normative questions about what's the right things to coordinate over. But the point is that law can make it easier or harder. It can kind of choose how that will go and what kinds of property rights are implicated. Okay, let's talk for a second about excess home capacity, which I mentioned before. There's actually been some interesting innovations here, and I guess the question is whether the trend will continue or whether it has reached its limit already, or maybe gone beyond its limit. You decide. So couch surfing is one example. There's a site called couchsurfing.com. you know, you've got an extra couch, it's some excess capacity in your house, you know, nobody's using it. Why not? Go on the internet, find people who are traveling, and I think it's done without actually payments. It's like reciprocal or something, but you know, you let them be on your couch. Why not? Okay, there's also land share. Say you have a garden or a backyard or some little area of land. Well, maybe you aren't so good at gardening, but you know, you happen to live in this house that comes with this lot, and you aren't able under the property law to like sell off this particular slice of land. Well, in that case, you know, you might want to join up with land share and make a deal with someone who's going to come over and garden in that spot. Okay, there might be a way to sort of parcel off excess capacity. It might also be a way to kind of adapt to existing land use restrictions that may be saying, you know, you have to own this much land in order to live here. Well, I don't want that much land. Let me make a deal with someone where they work some of it for me or something like that. Okay, another alternative here is, I just recently learned about this. I guess it's been around for a little while. There's something called Clue. Has anybody heard of this? It's an app that, and I do not know on the ground like how popular this is or how unpopular, but the basic idea is it's an app that purports to show you people around you, say you're in a city, people near you in the city who will let you use their bathroom. Okay? And so, you know, what you do, I don't know if you can read this, what you do is you basically click on one that you want to use, and then they get a message on their smartphone that says a PE has requested to use your loo, oh, what to do, and you can accept or decline. If you accept, then they can come on over. And again, you know, this is a way of contracting over excess capacity. The question is this too costly somehow? You know, not monetarily, but just, you know, privacy. Okay, so at any rate, these are possibilities. Of course, the other option would be to have less of these things inside your house and more available publicly. There's a lot of ways that law could be implicated in that. Okay, another question is that's related to this is whether to provide things in-house or try to outsource them. Lots of things fall in this category. I tried to think of a bunch of them. You can probably think of more. But there's lots of things about entertaining, socializing, hosting guests. You could do those in your house. You could do it outside of your house. Studying and working, various types of work could be done in the house, not in the house. Bathing, restrooms, laundry facilities, those things don't have to be in the dwelling. Many places they are not. But you know, often they are. So that's another choice. You have a bathtub or a washing machine that maybe sits idle a lot, but you have the option at any moment to make use of it, which is valuable. Okay, making and repairing things. There's all kinds of stuff you might do in your house, like sewing, right? People might sew their own clothes or do other things. You might care for your car. You might grow food. You might cook. You might. You might eat at home. You might exercise at home. You might use your home as this kind of platform for storing stuff or archiving it or displaying things that you like. You might use it for child rearing or education of your children in the case of homeschooling or the care of other dependents. You might bring into your home nature, animals, trees, water features, or you might not. You might say, I'm going to go somewhere else to get my nature, animals, trees, water features. Okay, and so, sometimes putting these things in-house requires that you actually have a bigger spatial footprint to your home. Not always. There's a kind of an interesting example here in Vienna where it's an apartment building that actually integrates a lot of trees, I don't know how, that sort of grow out of the windows and are sort of part of the whole thing. I don't know if anyone's been there and has more insight. But at any rate, there's lots of ways to kind of make these calls. So the last thing I want to just mention before we open up for questions is that one of the ways that we can kind of think about this question, people are making these trade-offs all the time. And I've mentioned that law can do a lot to kind of figure out you know, how to make choices more expensive or cheaper along different dimensions. But one way to sort of think about it is to understand that the home is always kind of producing a form of mixed ownership in a sense. There's always a household that owns certain things, and there's always some sort of common ownership of other things that are also kind of part of your experience of the home. Okay, and in this example, the way I've drawn it here, I have this sort of heavy line that separates out you know, what we might think of as a single-family home that's owned by a household. They own the yard, they own you know, the interior, they own the investment risk, But then there's a lot of other things that they hold in common. The neighborhood ambience is not going to be under their control. It's going to depend on what all their neighbors do. Lots of things about the city, the metro area, how good's the transportation, how good are the schools, all these things outside of their control. And the question is that whenever we have a line like this between what's privately owned and what's owned in common, we worry about tragedies of the commons taking place. Okay, we always kind of worry about that. We can imagine that this is the same kind of situation comes up in the kind of classic tragedy of the commons, where you have, if you go to sort of the example of overgrazing on a common pasture, you have the privately owned cow, right? And the owner of the cow gets to keep everything, gets to keep the cow, everything the cow can eat, and so on. And the commons is a sort of grazing area. Well, it's the mismatch. It's the fact that we have a common area for grazing, but that all of the sort of grass kind of gets internalized, literally, to the cow that's privately owned. Okay, so when we think about how households are using common areas and to what extent they may have spillovers on them, then this really matters when we think about how to, how law wants to kind of try to manage this and how, sort of how it wants to manage this interface. So this is, of course, not the only model of housing. We can imagine others, and I'll run through them kind of quickly, and we can do more in question and answer if you like. But we can do things like have a private residential community, where we have a neighborhood that's under some kind of private control, collective control, that's kind of this limited access commons that, it could literally be a gated community, but it wouldn't have to be. The idea is that everybody in there may be bound by certain covenants and has to do certain things. And so that helps to control certain kinds of commons problems. But it doesn't get rid of our line. In fact, it actually adds another line, in a sense, in that what you do with your private community, that might have implications for what happens in the city as a whole. There's a lot of concerns about if people form little exclusive enclaves, what does that do to the things that are going to be publicly provided in a larger commons? Okay? We can also, of course, have a rental apartment that draws lines differently. You have a landlord and the household. I've kind of drawn the line here between consumption stream and investment risk in that the household is occupying, enjoying the space. Landlord is bearing the risk of the investment, maybe is in charge of the exterior and the yard and so on. And then there's sort of this, this question of the interior that is kind of owned by the landlord, but the household is the one that has to sort of live within it. And so they may sort of share their ownership there in a sense. In terms of the household is sort of in control of its own efforts in determining what that's going to be like. And so landlord-tenant law has to kind of manage this one interface. Then there's still the interface between the landlord and everybody else. And there would be yet other ways we could imagine doing this, hybrid arrangements where you have some of the risk of owning a house outsourced to an investor. This is something I've written about in other work. And that would present still different sets of concerns. The point is we always have the lines. We always have the law having to kind of manage this interface between what's privately owned or what's owned by one owner and owned by somebody else and what's commonly owned. And the question is, where do we place those lines, and where do we want to encourage households how do we want to encourage households to configure themselves so that these lines are placed sort of as well as they can be? Okay, so I have lots more slides. I'm happy to talk about it, but I will stop here and get your questions. And I think I just have a nice picture we can stare at while we think about that. Yes?
It seems like our current laws really incentivize the first model of housing that you have, which is like sort of big on your own, because we have, and owner-occupant, because we have the mortgage interest deduction, we have protection of gains, any investment gains that you get in your house. And sometimes it seems like that causes problems. Like condos don't necessarily make sense for individual ownership because you have holdout problems that might prevent it from being sold if there's a better opportunity. Do you think those current laws that we have incentivizing it make sense, or would you propose some ways to tailor it better?
Yeah, so there's real questions about whether the kinds of laws that we have that the way that they may skew people in favor of owning versus renting, does that make sense? So I guess I'll sort of try to answer that with some other questions. I guess the question is, what do we think we're buying with that tax expenditure? What is it that we think is valuable about it? There have been a lot of studies to try to say whether homeownership has these good benefits for people. And it turns out that a lot of the benefits that are attributed to homeownership, really, when you break it down, it comes down to living in a place for a long time. And the question then becomes, can we get those benefits in other ways? Is this a good way of getting that set of benefits? And so, you know, some of my work has kind of looked at questions, and many other people's work as well, questions of whether there might be ways to have something that's kind of halfway in between owning and renting that might actually get us a lot of the kind of benefits of long-term stability, so that you wouldn't be a renter who might always like lose your place if the rent goes up, but so you wouldn't also be someone who is sort of on the hook for all these investment returns and all the investment risk, which may actually be something that many households are not in a particularly good position to bear, and that we're maybe making them buy more, like a bigger package than they really need or really want. It might be that the part of homeownership that some people at least really want is not the part about, I'm going to speculate in the housing market and I hope to make a gazillion bucks because my home appreciates. It's just, I want to live in a place and know that I won't ever be sort of forced out. Or at least there's a good chance I won't ever be forced out. I won't ever be forced out by rent increases or the landlord deciding to, you know, move back in or whatever else. Yes?
In your paper, are you pretty much just raising a bunch of the questions you've raised in this presentation on these issues, or in addition to that, do you also sort of get into maybe arguments as to how the law should deal with these sorts of questions that you're raising?
Yeah, so it's always easier to ask the questions and to actually come up with really good answers to them. And so yeah, so I'm still working on some of the answers, but I think what I would say is that once we kind of recognize that there's a bunch of different options out there about how we could do these configurations, and we think about the full menu of choices, well, we notice that in the real world we don't see all those choices. Sometimes it's because the law takes certain things off the table. Sometimes it's because it just makes them more expensive. Sometimes it's because markets, for whatever reason, don't develop in that particular area. And so I guess what I'm always wanting to do, and this is something I've done on other topics as well, is kind of look at places where we see gaps and think about whether there's a reason for the gap. And I think that there are gaps that there are not good reasons for, and that they're sort of artifacts of other ways that we've chosen to arrange things. Let me just show you, I think I can go to another slide. Whoops. This slide here. If we sort of think about housing as kind of a spectrum, we could imagine, you know, I sort of talked about thin and thick, and this is sort of putting it all on one spectrum is a little bit of a simplification. But if we think about kind of the thinnest imaginable sort of housing services, which would be like the ability to, you know, sleep in a park or something like that, or on a sidewalk, or in a shelter, to the very thickest, which would be like owning your house outright, you don't have a mortgage or anything. Well, it's interesting that there's sort of gaps along this spectrum where there are things that we don't actually observe. And so I think there's sort of pressure to sort of say why. So like to take point B on this example, okay? Well, to the extent that we have a minimum standard of how big and how nice or whatever, what kind of amenities are required in order for a rental to be legal, then we have kind of a lower bound of what's an acceptable leasehold. We have a body of landlord-tenant law that governs that. Okay, so maybe point C is the lowest you can go on that scale. Point B is illegal. But that doesn't mean that everybody is able to achieve point C, because we have a separate body of law that governs, you know, we have other ways of dealing when there are people who don't have homes at all. Okay, and so the question is, well, what's wrong with point B? Why don't we have it? Is there a good reason? Is there something about ruling that out that makes it more possible for more people to achieve point C? Is that what's going on? Are there spillovers from point B that we don't get from point A, in a sense? Are there things that, you know, and we want to have as many people as possible achieving this minimum leasehold? So that's sort of one set of questions. And then further down the spectrum, we have another gap where, as I was just mentioning, there's kind of this gap between leasing and owning, where we don't really offer a lot of alternatives for people who want something that's more than a leasehold. They want to actually, they want to sort of own the place in the sense they can do what they want with it, they can modify it, they can redecorate it, they can enjoy the gains or suffer the losses of their decorating choices and what they do to the house, but they don't necessarily want all the risk of, you know, the economy and that local housing market and what's happening nationally with housing. And they don't want sort of all those factors to affect what their investment returns are. And so then we see another gap. And so one of the things I want to try to think about is, along a lot of different dimensions, where do we see the spaces and the gaps and the things that don't emerge? And I think there's sort of a burden in a sense to sort of see why it is, is there something about the way that the law is working that's creating distortions that are ruling those out? Or is it actually that these things are not there for extremely good reasons? And I guess I'm suspicious that there's always extremely good reasons for the things that aren't there, and so that's sort of my intuition, but I want to try to nail that down a little bit more in some specific areas. Other questions? Yes, Ms. Cooper.
You brought up, I think briefly, like the legal issues that are being created, or maybe even like the community issues that are being created from gated communities, and how that affects people who aren't living in the gated communities.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could elaborate on that.
Sure, of course. So this is sort of another issue of where we have problems kind of at different scales. So I guess to sort of explain why we might have a gated community, and a gated community is just one type of a private residential community. You can have, it's actually becoming a very common housing type to have a private neighborhood that's governed by a homeowners association and governed by covenants, even if there's actually no gate around it. But either way, we have this form, and it's thought to solve certain kinds of problems for the people who are living in the community. Like maybe they don't want their neighbor to paint their house a horrible color or something like that. So there's a lot of restrictions on what people can do, and it solves these kinds of tragedies of the commons within the neighborhood. The concern is, which you raise, is that, well, the more that we create these kinds of homogeneous enclaves that are designed to kind of solve problems within, are we creating a bigger problem outside? Right? Are we thereby making it harder and harder for people who aren't there? And so one aspect of this has to do with kind of this question of what's inside and what's outside. And so when you have private communities, a lot of times they're going to be providing some of their own like recreational facilities. They're going to maybe have their own pool, their own parks. And so that kind of privatizes this, and it might reduce the pressure, the political will to put a lot of money into having a really nice park or a really nice swimming facility that's open to the public at large. And so the question is whether that ends up being a problem if we think not everyone is going to be within one of these communities. We may also worry that some of the things, and this kind of goes back to the little picture I had of where everybody contracts to have space around their house and have sort of spacious areas. Some of the things that people may contract over within these communities may end up ruling out certain other goals. So of course one thing we worry about is that we'll have people will have sort of concentrated poverty, and we'll have sort of segregation by economic class, right? And so when we have these kinds of communities that are homogeneous in terms of the very expensive houses, or even if they're not very expensive, if it's just sort of middle class and sort of everyone sort of is at the same income level, well, having a lot of these does interfere if we think that there's an important goal of having housing at different income levels mixed together. If we think that there are gains from that, that's something that we potentially are giving up. Some of these things come back to empirical questions. Some of them are questions about, sort of normatively what we think is the right thing to do, how to build a community, and then it always comes to the question of scale. Like when we're thinking about what kind of communities we want, well, are we always going to want at the block level to have a certain kind of profile of income mixing, or do we want that sort of only at a bigger scale? And it depends on what we think are sort of the gains and what we think sort of the costs and benefits of different ways of trying to do that. But yeah, I think it's absolutely right to think that we often can solve a problem. It looks like we're solving a problem within some scope, but we always have to look and see what happens when you look outside that circle.
In your response to the first question, you mentioned that the benefits of home ownership are primarily due to staying in one place for a long time.
A lot of them, yeah.
If we think that current and future generations will be more mobile or less locationally stable, does it make sense, instead of or in addition to expanding the points from D to F to make it more possible to be locationally stable, to identify and disaggregate those benefits so that they can be provided to people who can't stay in the same place?
Right. So one question, so a couple things here. One question that you didn't quite ask, but I'm going to sort of say something about it anyway, is kind of a question of if we think that there's benefits from stability, to what extent is that because of the way that we've set up our society? And maybe that's not good. If we, you hear a lot about people being really attached to their homes and so on, and we might think that, well, maybe that's natural or something, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's sort of socially constructed. And if we had different kinds of societal arrangements, people wouldn't be so attached. Okay, so if everybody knew, so I think it's interesting. One of the things I'm trying to work through is a bunch of different kind of thought experiments. What if we had a society that was sort of premised on the idea of everybody having to move, like every 3 months or something like that, right? You just have to go somewhere else. You can't stay here any longer. Well, there's a lot of things that we might expect, a lot of negative effects, and so that's why it's just a thought experiment. But we can imagine that if there were more frequent moving, and if people sort of knew that that was part of life, well, they might do a lot of things that would it would be a form of self-help to sort of buffer the impact of that. Okay, now some of the things we think would be bad, like people might not invest in making friends with their neighbors because, hey, I'm leaving in 3 months, I'm not going to have anything to do with you, so why bother? And that's the concern. I think that's a lot of the benefits from home ownership. We think, well, okay, they come from this idea that people are more willing to invest in the community if they know they're likely to stay. They're more likely to stay if they're owners than if they're not. But there might be other things. Maybe just getting too attached to a structure is kind of an issue. And I think it does help to separate out questions of mobility from questions of staying in exactly the same structure. So if we do have, say, a mixed income community, this is a point that Jane Jacobs made. If we have a mixed income community, then it might be possible for people to have thick ties in the community and have a lot of the benefits of stability and the willingness to invest in the community, even if they don't stay in their exact same house. Because there'd be options within the same community where they could move as their household expands or contracts. There'd be a lot of different types of housing. And so what might matter more than kind of the tenure form or exactly staying in the structure is being in the community. And we see homeownership, this is sort of a way that we have traditionally used to kind of get to that goal. It might not be the only way to get to that goal. Shall I show you another slide? Okay, I want to. So one thing that this I think raises, the last question in fact, is kind of a question of how do we think about people's spending time in the home over time? How do we think about that? Well, I first posed the question. I think the answer to this is actually no, but I first posed the question just to get you to think about it, which is housing kind of like a bridge? A bridge is kind of a classic example of a step good. A step good is something where it's not any good unless you have enough of it. Okay, so a bridge is like this. If you have a bridge that's going over a chasm, if you have it like almost, that's not good. It doesn't actually get you anywhere. You need the whole thing. Okay, so is housing like that? So we might think that we have like from 1 year to sort of infinity, getting to stay forever. Is it like that it's only sort of good if you get to stay there forever? Well, I don't think anyone thinks it's really like that. People get a lot of benefit from shorter term housing situations, but we might wonder if it's lumpy. Okay, lumpy good. Lumpy is actually an economic term, believe it or not, which would be, maybe it's the case that as you stay places longer, it becomes more or less valuable to stay for an additional increment of time. It may be that, initially, you're sort of getting the same amount of good out of a place, but then maybe it starts to accelerate. Maybe it's like after a while, wow, I really love this neighborhood. I've really made a lot of friends here, and I feel I belong here, and it gets better and better. And then I guess in this picture, I sort of have it leveling off after a while. Maybe it's like, okay, well, that's enough. That's as good as it's going to get. But the question might be, well, if we think that housing has these features, and I think people implicitly have in mind something kind of like this a lot of times when they talk about the importance of keeping people in their homes over time. This idea that there's something especially valuable. It's not kind of linear. It's like you get some additional sort of traction from being there for a longer time. So if we think it's like that, then that would implicate this question of, it would affect how we would address this question of what law should do about keeping people in homes for a shorter or longer period of time, what kinds of risks we should let people take, what we should do about things like rent control maybe that have impacts on people staying in a community or not, but may have other effects that we like or don't like. So all these things I think matter, and some of these are empirical questions that we don't have good information on, And I think there's been some interesting work trying to like pin that down a bit better and say we can't just assume everyone wants to stay in their house forever. Maybe that's not right. And then to the extent we think it's kind of socially constructed or endogenous to the way that we deal with things, the question becomes even harder because we're asking people, you know, sort of about their preferences for something that they're already used to. And here's where I think it can help to look at other countries and look at other places where maybe homeownership is not as common, and think about, you know, think about different models for how we set up residential living generally. Yes?
I actually have a question about the 2 slides back, the scale that you had. You suggested that there might be some benefits to filling in the gaps, to having things other than those 3 basic categories.
Yeah.
If we accept that there are good reasons for imposing lower bounds, and well, specifically lower bounds on like what is okay for an apartment or a house in terms of size or quality, do you see a sustainable way of enforcing those quality requirements while also accepting that maybe they're in between? So for example, how do we enforce quality requirements for how big a house can be if we also accept that things like granny flats, I guess, are okay? Like how do we stop people from taking a home, calling them a combination of granny flats when in fact they're just cramming a bunch of people into this house in violation of what we think would be the reason for not doing it?
So I'm not sure completely if your question is about kind of how easy it is to enforce whatever restrictions there are on housing. I mean, I think you're right that whenever we do have restrictions on housing, there's kind of this hydraulic kind of pressure that may build up. If the restriction that exists doesn't match the way that people want to live, then they're going to try to do things to adapt. And so one thing that we see is if we have a minimum size for a leasehold, for example, well, that's going to put some affordability constraint in, and that's going to mean that maybe households are going to be bigger. And it may be that the lease that you make with your landlord says there's going to be 2 people living here, but it turns out that, well, actually there's going to be 16 because this is how you can afford this minimum place or whatever, right? So there may be instances where it undermines the original goal, I think might be part of your point, right? If people are doubling up families and things like that in places because some of these smaller options aren't available, well, that may undermine exactly what we were trying to achieve in the first place. The other thing is that there might just be illegal rentals that violate this, like people just, you know, you're not supposed to subdivide your house into granny flats, but who's going to come and knock on the door and check and see if this is a separate unit with a separate entrance, and so people maybe just do it. Just subdivide their houses in various ways, right? So, and a lot of this may fly under the radar in certain ways, and whenever we see people doing that, to the extent we see that, to the extent we see things like doubling up and so on, it may be something that we should think about, like is this sort of showing us a place where the law is creating a pressure that we see people responding to in a particular way, and whether that should somehow tell us something about how the law should respond. Yes?
So I guess in sort of a follow-up on that, we're really looking for sort of like what our Coasian solution is to all of this. So on the one hand, we're saying, okay, so we set these, you know, assuming there were no rules, where like people could bargain and presumably we would end up in an efficient outcome at some point. So we know there's transaction costs with dealing with people, and additionally these rules set up either very high transaction costs or make certain transactions impossible, right? Say you don't want to avoid having tens of people living in one house, you say, you know, not only is there a number of limit the number of people in a single house, but you limit how far you can subdivide a house.
Yes.
So we're trying to balance basically how we're solving these like collective actions problems over a community agreeing on something versus like what the efficient outcome would be without those, and like because you could get to the same outcome through like restrictive covenants, right? Perhaps. So the question is like, how do we figure out which one is better from like sort of like a Coasian view, or
right.
How are we? I'm trying to like put a big picture on this.
Yeah. So great question. So part of your question, I think, is, you know, maybe if I, to the extent that I seem like I'm complaining about things that the law is doing about restricting choices, well, maybe people left to their own devices, this is actually the deal they would make. We might actually see, because the point might be that even though we could imagine a lot of people who want to get around whatever existing restrictions there are, well, they're wanting to do that because it actually is imposing externalities on other people. It's actually causing problems that if everybody were able to sort of bargain together ex ante, nobody would actually want to have this. They would come up with an agreement that would look like what the law is already doing. I mean, that's possible. So part of the question is to try to figure out when the law is responding to a potential incentive distortion that we see, when is it responding to one? When is it correcting one? And when is it introducing one? When is what we're seeing just kind of an artifact of the fact that maybe we have different, we have separate landlord-tenant law from laws governing mortgages, and we have different bodies of law that's evolved that maybe leave certain gaps. To what extent should we think about that as something that might just be an artifact that doesn't actually replicate what we would end up with? But I agree with you. I mean, we can think about a lot of this by sort of thinking about what kind of deals we think people would make, but it gets complicated for the reasons we talked about before, because we have this question of scale. We can say, well, yeah, maybe you're right that a private community would come up with a deal like this, but the reason they would do that is because that's going to have an impact on who lives in the community in a sense, right? I mean, not everyone then will be able to live in that community that puts that limit on, and therefore we would have to say, well, we would have to look at it as a more global bargain. Like, would everyone agree to this in the whole community, given the fact that there's impacts from reaching this smaller private agreement that's with less than all the people involved? Yes?
So suppose that we think it's bad for private communities to find ways to segregate themselves on any number of classifications that
Sure.
they might want to. Is there any reason to think that we can ultimately stop them from doing that? It seems that in terms of people are really good at building these communities that are extremely wealthy or offer amenities that they think will, in a Stricklovitz type way, exclude people. Are we actually able to kind of stop people from adapting and creating their private segregated communities?
Well, I mean, there are certain things the law can do. I mean, anti-discrimination law can do certain things. You're right to raise Professor Stricklowitz's work on the fact that sometimes things can fly under the radar. If we have communities, you're alluding to his exclusionary amenities work that suggests that maybe we have communities that have costly amenities that they force everyone to pay for, and they do it in a way that they think will actually have some kind of segregative effect. So yeah, I mean, I think that we always have to think about these questions. We always have to think about adaptation in response to laws, but law may be able to change the prices for things, right? And to the extent we think people are responding to incentives, and also sometimes it's about having alternatives available that maybe, we have people bargaining within a particular set of options that are out there. There may be some options lots of people would like that just don't exist yet, and we don't know what those look like because they aren't there. But there may be some things that the law could do to create additional options that would actually draw away a lot of demand from some of these other places. At least we might think that. Adam? One last question, anybody? No? Okay, well, I think we're about out of time. I think we better stop here. Thank you all so much.